They pretty much got rid of Heinrich, so there was no backcourt to really, share for him to share the ball with. It was just he was gonna be a one-headed monster point guard. I mean, when your starting shooting guard is Keith Bogans, obviously you're gonna be doing a majority of the ball handling. I thought that was a big factor in why he became the player he became in the third season. Opportunity.
That's what it takes in the league, for sure. You got to have the opportunity to shine and succeed or fail at it. So he took that and ran with it, for sure.
I'm mentioning this because I feel the same way about you. Yeah,
So I'm that guy. I'm the guy who wanted Monte Ellis off the Warriors. And you got Jonathan Kuminga fans going crazy. Jonathan Kuminga has proven absolutely nothing in this league in 4 years already. Anybody and everybody who has ever listened to me talk on this channel and about the Warriors in general knows that I have major issues when it comes to Steve Kerr and the way he coaches the Warriors. Particularly over the last 3 years, Steve Kerr has been absolutely useless, absolute clownish coaching. The guy has just gone off the rails ever since he lost Mike Brown after winning the title back in the 21-22 season. Now, anybody who happens to be a fan of Jonathan Kuminga also happens to heavily dislike Steve Kerr for obvious reasons. Steve Kerr has been yo-yoing Jonathan Kuminga's role throughout the course of his career with the Warriors. And by the end of this season, Steve was essentially DMPing Kuminga. So a lot of Kuminga fans were very upset, saying that, his potential is not being realized under this coach who can't seem to develop young talent of any kind. And there's a lot of truth in that statement. But it's ironic that Jonathan Kuminga fans really dislike Steve Kerr. I also really dislike Steve Kerr, and yet I cannot really get along with Jonathan Kuminga fans because I happen to agree with Steve Kerr's assessment of Jonathan Kuminga when it comes to him playing a role for the Golden State Warriors. And that should tell you something. If I'm just a hater of Steve Kerr for no good reason without any logic, then why wouldn't I just support Kuminga fans and be like, yeah, you guys are absolutely right. Steve Kerr is trash. He's awful. And that is the reason why Jonathan Kuminga has not been good enough for the Warriors. But me, on this channel, I'm here to speak the truth, and sometimes Steve Kerr can get some things right. And I'm sorry, Jonathan Kuminga fans, but Steve Kerr happens to be right when it comes to Kuminga and his assessment of whether he belongs on this team or not, and whether he deserves to be starting for this team or not. So I'm gonna really get to the bottom of this situation once and for all and come to a definitive conclusion as far as what needs to happen moving forward. And if that sounds good to you, be sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and that like button so that this analysis gets out to all the basketball fans out there. Okay, so first and foremost, Steve Kerr was apparently in Tim Kawakami's podcast talking about this very issue of how he feels about Kuminga and what his role needs to be going into next season. And well, if you listen to this, basically, Jonathan Kuminga is all but gone. Take a listen.
I've been asked to win. And right now, he's not a guy who I can say I'm going to play 38 minutes with the roster that we have, Steph and Jimmy and Draymond and put the puzzle together that way and expect to win. Doesn't mean he's not a really good player. Doesn't mean he's not. To me, it's like...
Okay, now let me give you a quick summary of my assessment of Jonathan Kuminga since his rookie year. I have a tweet right here that I'm going to post that's going to let you know what I said about Kuminga and his defense in particular in his rookie year. And to paraphrase, essentially, I said that his defense is borderline on a project level when it comes to its viability and whether he's going to be good enough to help Steph Curry reach the promised land at some point in his career. So that is to basically say Jonathan Kuminga was the wrong pick for the Warriors because Bob Myers and Joe Lacob and that front office were ultimately on a different timeline than Steph Curry, even though he was still on the roster and only 32 years old. First, they drafted James Wiseman because they were no longer on the Steph Curry timeline after losing Kevin Durant. to free agency. That's why I often use the word charlatan when it comes to describing these guys, because how can you have Steph Curry on your roster? He had won 3 titles for your team, and somehow they concluded that, all of that happened because of Kevin Durant, even though the first title literally came before Kevin Durant, and then they proceeded to have the greatest regular season of all time. Steph Curry, unanimous MVP, never happened before in NBA history, and then he ends up getting hurt in the playoffs, and then ends up coming back too early just to help the team in the playoffs. But as he continued to play through each round, the situation got worse and worse. You could see that his mobility just simply wasn't there. He was playing through an MCL sprain and a bunch of other issues, shoulder injury, whatever. But the biggest issue was that he had a mobility problem where he couldn't even blow by Kevin Love anymore. And because of that, with the combination of Draymond getting suspended, and then in Game 6, Andrew Bogut gets injured, and then everything is left on the table in Game 7, and the Warriors ended up blowing it. And even then, Steve Kerr had a lot to do with it. The guy was playing a whole bunch of goofy rotations, starting Festus Ezeli despite the fact that the guy was scared out of his mind. And he even dared to play Festus Ezeli late in the 4th quarter, 3 minutes left to go or so, and he still has Festus Ezeli out there getting abused by LeBron James off of switches. Everybody loves to talk about how Steph Curry choked away a 3-1 lead. It's all his fault, even though he was playing on one good leg, while ignoring the fact that it is actually Steve Kerr who blew a 3-1 lead. Yeah, I have real-time reactions from that time period as well, as you can see right here. And that is when Steve Kerr really fell out of favor with me. Anyway, that was a bit of a digression. Ultimately, Joe Lacob decided, we're not gonna win anything anymore even though we have Steph Curry because we lost Kevin Durant. Disgusting. A complete and utter ingrate. This guy thinks he's some kind of mastermind and he's like, I'm gonna build for the future now. So when Steph Curry retires, now it's gonna be my era. It's gonna be Joe Lacob time. And we're gonna be in the playoffs constantly and competing and being the amazing team that we've been all these years, not realizing that all of it had to do with Steph Curry. The reason Kevin Durant ever thought about joining this pathetic franchise, the Golden State Warriors, is because Steph Curry made it what it was and turned them into a championship team. But no. Joe Lacob just does not get it and thinks that he's the mastermind of it all. This goofy guy. And next thing you know, he loves James Wiseman. Oh my gosh, this kid is so smart. He speaks Mandarin. And James Wiseman, roughly a week into his career, I scouted him and called him a complete and utter project. They need to bench him immediately because the kid has no idea how to play the game of basketball. Not at all. And on top of that, Steve Kerr refuses to run any kind of pick and roll action for the guy and simplifying the situation at least. But even if he did that, James Wiseman still would have made it almost impossible for the Warriors to look like a competitive team. Because he wasn't. You know, even a guy like Jermaine O'Neal, who came straight out of high school, ended up taking 4 years before he became like a legitimate starter in the NBA, man. James Wiseman needed a lot of time to develop his game so that he knows how to play at the NBA level, because defensively, the guy was a complete and utter joke. Everybody was driving into the paint and tooling him like he was a JUCO player. Zero basketball instincts, this guy. No idea how to time shots, has no idea what these NBA players are gonna do, so they're just getting all these shots up left and right freely, with James Wiseman being like 2 seconds late on the contests. And see, one thing about me and scouting is that I'm almost never wrong. I know NBA defense, and I know when I see a good defender, and I know when I see a guy that will never amount to a good defender in the NBA, and that is what James Wiseman was. It would literally take him at least half a decade before this guy would realize any potential as a defender or a two-way player in the NBA, and that doesn't make any sense to put next to Steph Curry the greatest player of this generation, or should be if Joe Lacob properly recognized what he had. But he ends up wasting the 2021 season completely and utterly because they wanted to develop and prioritize James Wiseman, and the Warriors are doing absolutely nothing. For like the first 3 months or so, they were not able to string together 3 straight wins. Do you understand how pathetic that is? The Warriors, with Steph Curry on the roster, were not able to get 3 straight wins until the month of February. That is Steve Kerr for you. How completely and utterly embarrassing. But I don't want to digress too much. Ultimately, the Warriors wasted the opportunity to get real talent by trading away James Wiseman so that he can develop on an actual lottery team where he belonged. And then the front office doubled down on this strategy. And instead of drafting guys, they had the 7th pick and they had the 14th pick in the 21 draft. And instead of drafting guys that are more ready to contribute right now in the NBA, they decide to go after talent. Talent. No matter how raw, no matter how unready they may be, they said, we're gonna draft the best talent with what we got with the 7th pick, and they went and got Jonathan Kuminga, who was not ready to contribute whatsoever to a winning situation. The guy didn't even attend college. His first year where he could have been in college, he spent in the G League, where he was completely and utterly inefficient. 39% from the field, 25% from the three-point line, 63% from the free throw line over 13 games. More importantly, I scouted him when they started giving him minutes in the regular season after Draymond Green ended up going down. And remember, 21-22 season, the championship year, the Warriors started 18-2, and Jonathan Kuminga had nothing to do with that run. And then Draymond eventually gets injured, Jonathan Kuminga comes into the equation, and the Warriors were absolutely awful. They went through stretches where they were like 2-10. That was the championship year, guys. And you know what's really funny about that? When they started Otto Porter Jr., the Warriors had like a 10-2 record. But instead of doing that, they decided to experiment with Jonathan Kuminga, and the Warriors were playing like a lottery team. They started the season off playing like a championship team, and then they started playing like a lottery team. See, the thing about the NBA is that you are ultimately the product of the players that you put on the floor. Even if you have a Steph Curry on the floor, if the subsequent talent around him is not good enough, then the Warriors are not gonna look like a serious team. And that's no different even if your name is Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan also did nothing in his career when his teammates were simply not good enough. There was not enough talent around him. Before Scottie Pippen, Michael Jordan did nothing. Zero. Getting swept out of the playoffs is what he did. The game of basketball is a team sport. No matter how great one single individual is, the whole makeup of the team is going to determine just how great that one player can be. When the surrounding conditions are excellent and correct, that's when that one really good player can determine for you whether you are a playoff team, a championship caliber team, or a dynastic team. So when the surrounding conditions for Steph Curry is right, meaning there's a bunch of veterans around him and a bunch of defenders around him, Steph Curry goes and wins titles for you. Literally think about that 21-22 season. No star that you can name is going to go win a title with that roster unless your name is Steph Curry, because his second best player that season was Andrew Wiggins. And surrounding Steph Curry with a bunch of raw, young talent, missing a bunch of stuff in their game, like basic defense in the NBA. Forget about great defense, forget about great potential for defense. We're talking about raw. One thing that I do not get wrong when it comes to NBA players is determining whether they are a viable defender in the NBA or not. I can see it right away. And if I can see it right away, I can determine how long it's going to take these players to become that type of player. Because if you're a great defender, you come into the NBA as a great defender from the jump. And then you get better and better and better. But if you come into the NBA as a raw defender, you're either going to take half a decade to become any kind of defender, or you're just never actually a defender, and before you know it, you're out of the NBA. Do you know how many athletic marvels have come into the NBA and fizzled out quickly because they don't know how to use their minds to actually make use of the athleticism some of these players possess? So ultimately, more or less, in his first year, when the Warriors were trying to win a title, Kuminga wasn't very useful to the Warriors. By the time they got to the conference finals and the finals, Kuminga was nowhere to be found in the rotation, and rightfully so, because they had a veteran, even though they got him for $2 million. Otto Porter Jr., a former 3rd overall pick, was a complete and utter veteran, perfect piece to put next to Steph Curry, a guy who's been there, done that, doesn't care about his own scoring opportunities, whatever. He was there to do his job as a defender, as a small forward, power forward, whatever they needed him to do, he was able to do, and he could actually defend power forwards, which is what allowed the Warriors to continue to play their small lineups. Next to Draymond, you need another viable power forward, and that ended up being Otto Porter Jr. that year. And then they go and win the title, and then in the offseason, instead of prioritizing the guys that helped you win a damn title, you go and lose Otto Porter Jr. for $6 million per year over a 2-year period so that you can hold on to Jonathan Kuminga. Good job, Joe Lacob. Congratulations. You are a complete and utter charlatan thinking about your future and bragging about, oh, the 2 timeline thing worked perfectly. We just won a title, knowing, or should be knowing, that these kids had nothing to do with the Warriors winning a title. And then the next season comes, and then you have James Wiseman, Jonathan Kuminga, Jordan Poole, 3 zeros on defense, all in rotation at the same time. And it's a complete and utter shit show. And then the Warriors partly right the ship in James Wiseman's 3rd year, trading him for GP2 instead of just signing GP2 and trading James Wiseman away for something else. Do you know that after the first year of James Wiseman's career, the Raptors were interested in getting him in a trade, and they were willing to give up Pascal Siakam? Do you know how many times over the last 3 to 4 years the names Pascal Siakam and OG Anunoby have come up for the Warriors because the Raptors, after losing Kawhi Leonard in free agency, were looking to essentially start over. And that whole time, Joe Lacob refused to give up James Wiseman, Jonathan Kuminga. These are his prized lottery picks and the future of his franchise. And completely and utterly disrespecting Steph Curry, the guy who made him 20 times and over richer than what he was, because he turned the Warriors from being a $400 million franchise into a $9 billion franchise. I've simply never seen anything like it. Around that time, in Kuminga's 2nd year, early on, I made a video about how Joe Lacob needed to stop the 2 timeline plan immediately and trade away James Wiseman and trade away Jonathan Kuminga. He traded away Wiseman, but he held on to Jonathan Kuminga, who was inconsistent in his 2nd year to play championship caliber basketball, and lost his role to Anthony Lamb. And then eventually he got back in rotation and he had some really good moments. The problem with Jonathan Kuminga is that overall he is an inconsistent player. And inconsistent players don't help you win titles when you get to the playoffs. So they get to the playoffs in the first round against the Kings, and Kuminga is completely and utterly useless. And what's really crazy about that is that they had the opportunity to trade him away with some other pieces that weren't their core pieces, like Andrew Wiggins, Klay Thompson, obviously Steph Curry, Draymond. All these guys could have stayed on the team, and they could have moved Jonathan Kuminga and gotten back OG Anunoby. And think about how the Warriors got to the 2nd round of the playoffs and took the Lakers to 6 games despite playing tiny lineups, having no power forward coming off their bench, and the Warriors having no size against the big Lakers team. If they had OG Anunoby going into that Lakers series, do you think they would have beaten the Lakers? They took the Lakers to 6 games with no OG Anunoby and Kuminga out of the rotation. If you can flip Kuminga, who was useless that year in the playoffs, for OG Anunoby, they are beating the Lakers. And all they would have to do is beat the Nuggets, and then they have a free path to a 2nd consecutive title against the Heat because the Heat were garbage in the finals. And if you haven't noticed, Steph Curry is better than Jimmy Butler. So because of Joe Laco's nonsensical greed and his utter disrespect for Steph Curry, that opportunity to two-peat was completely and utterly wasted. It really can't get more disrespectful than that. So when you look at it from that sense, the Jonathan Kuminga experiment was already a failure because you lost the opportunity to contend for a title because you didn't have enough pieces in the playoffs. And then if you remember what happened last season, the Warriors barely made it into the play-in, and that was after they ended up taking Jonathan Kuminga out of the starting lineup and replaced him with Trace Jackson-Davis, and then the Warriors went on a 10-2 run in the final 12 games of the season, and then ultimately got booted out of the play-in. Steph Curry, Andrew Wiggins, Draymond. That's another year where they had an opportunity to trade for OG Anunoby, and once again, they refused to do it, hung up the phone because the Raptors were asking for Kuminga. Booted out of the play-in 2 years before they won a title. Booted out of the play-in 2 years later. And then think about what happened this season. They started off really well, and then they started to falter completely, no thanks to Steve Kerr. And sure, the Kuminga fans love to talk about how Kuminga was playing really well before he got injured. But what were the Warriors doing as a team while he was quote-unquote thriving? The Warriors were playing like a lottery team, and they were barely in the 10th seed. They went from the 1st seed to the 10th seed. Do you know how hard that is to do? But that's what ended up happening. And the Warriors got so desperate that they actually made a big trade, got rid of Andrew Wiggins and brought in Jimmy Butler. And that was when Kuminga was out of the equation. And then the Warriors completely and utterly turned their season around and looked like one of the top 3 teams in the entire NBA with Kuminga out of the equation. And then as soon as Kuminga came back into the picture, they looked like a middle of the pack team once again. A single forward on a team can literally mess up the entire dynamics of your team. And the Warriors for the last 3 years have done absolutely zilch with Kuminga playing a role for this team. And anytime he was completely out of the equation over the last 3 years, the Warriors have played a thriving style of basketball. This team has wasted the last 3 years of Steph Curry's prime to prioritize some future potential of Jonathan Kuminga, who has never shown any ability to be a winning player in his life. And this is year 4 now. Year 4 has just ended. The Warriors in the playoffs in the second round basically swapped out Steph Curry with Jonathan Kuminga. Steph Curry was injured, Jonathan Kuminga was in the equation, and Kuminga got to play with everybody else that Steph Curry was playing with. And when Steph Curry was playing with these guys, they looked like a top 3 team in the league, like I said. And when Kuminga became like a prominent scorer with Steph Curry out of the equation, the Warriors failed to win a single game in the second round of the playoffs. All they needed to do was buy one win for Steph Curry to come back and have a chance to win a title. Look at what's happening in the playoffs now. OKC Thunder against the Timberwolves. Are you serious? It's a joke. The Warriors should have gotten rid of the Timberwolves in 5 games if Steph Curry was healthy. If they could have held on until he came back, they are beating the Timberwolves in 7 games and facing the Thunder. And SGA is not better than Steph freaking Curry. And then the only team that they would have to deal with in the finals is either the Knicks or the Pacers. Are you kidding me? And you know, last season they refused to give up Jonathan Kuminga for OG Anunoby. At the end of the day, they even tried to get Caruso before the deadline. And the Bulls wanted Jonathan Kuminga for Caruso. The Warriors should have done that deal. Can you imagine if the Warriors had Caruso this season instead of Jonathan Kuminga? What if they ended up making that deal for Jimmy Butler and they still had Caruso on the Warriors? Instead of depending on second-year player Brandon Podziemski and inconsistent Moses Moody, they could have had Alex Caruso, a proven championship caliber piece. No, not just the championship caliber piece, an actual champion. Now, having said all this does not mean that Jonathan Kuminga can't carve out a career with another team, putting up numbers like 21, 22 points or something like that. He's clearly a scorer in the NBA. To what extent, with what efficiency? Well, that remains to be seen. And crazy enough, former player Keon Dooling compared him to Tracy McGrady, which I think is completely and utterly insane. It's hard to come up with a comparison for Jonathan Kuminga's game, but if I had to, I would say that Corey Maggette, a former Warrior, is a really good comparison. And Corey Maggette carved out a pretty decent career for himself, but he was never anything close to a winner in the NBA. As a matter of fact, Corey Maggette was in the NBA for 14 years, and he made the playoffs one time. That, I think, is a really good comparison as far as what Jonathan Kuminga can do as like a primary player on a team. And if you look at Jonathan Kuminga's per 36, the numbers check out pretty well compared to Corey Maggette, who was a really good athlete himself. I would say that Corey Maggette was probably a better overall player than Jonathan Kuminga. He was a much better passer, playmaker, much better from the free throw line, and a pretty damn good athlete himself, but he was never much of a defender. Just like Jonathan Kuminga is not much of a defender. I think you will see that once Jonathan Kuminga moves on to different teams, and he's more of a scorer, a finesse guy, rather than a guy who can go and stop the other team's best player or anything close to that. And if he was more than that, of course, I would want him to stay on the Warriors because two-way wings are incredibly valuable in the NBA. But Jonathan Kuminga is not a consistent two-way player. And when he plays offense, he really just plays for himself. He's looking to score for himself. He's never really attacking with the intention of creating for others. And that severely limits his ability to really help the team overall. That's the difference between him and Jimmy Butler. Jimmy Butler is consistently creating opportunities and making his teammates better. That is not who Jonathan Kuminga is. There are different levels in the NBA, and even all-star caliber players are oftentimes not good enough to be title contenders. The perfect example of that is a player like Zach LaVine. Zach LaVine is an all-star in the NBA. How about Bradley Beal? An all-star. And these guys are certified scorers, and they're way more efficient than a guy like Jonathan Kuminga. And yet everybody knows that Bradley Beal, Zach LaVine, these guys are not serious. By the time you get to the playoffs, these guys are nowhere to be found. And if they somehow do make it to the playoffs, they're not going very far. These are the types of players they are, and Kuminga is in that mold. Actually, he has to get to that mold before we can even talk about him being some kind of playoff caliber player. Kuminga really hasn't even proven that he's a consistent finishing player in regular season play. Kuminga has not been a closing caliber player. He can contribute and score a lot in the first 3 quarters, but come the fourth quarter, especially in the final 5 to 6 minutes, when it's winning time, you have to clamp down and play two-way basketball. The more consistent two-way basketball that you play and the more of those guys you have, the more consistently you can win as a team. The less of those guys you have on your team, the less games you're gonna win in the NBA in general. And like I said, even in the playoffs, yes, Kuminga did have some really good moments in the playoffs with his opportunity to score a bunch of times. But when it came to closing time, with him in there, the Warriors did nothing. All they did was fall apart, not good enough, and again, couldn't win a single game. So yes, ultimately, Steve Kerr sees some of the same errors, probably for him more on the offensive side than the defensive side. But for me personally, my issue with Jonathan Kuminga was always on the defensive end of the floor. He just wasn't good enough and still is not good enough to be a title contending caliber player, a vital piece to a rotation. Think about it. If you had Jonathan Kuminga, let's say for the OKC Thunder, where would he be in their rotation? Would he be a starter? Would he be starting over J-Dub, Chet Holmgren? I don't think so. So is he even over Caruso? Is he even over Wiggins? Where would he be in their rotation? Or how about the Timberwolves? If Jonathan Kuminga was on that team, would he be starting over Jaden McDaniels? You gotta put Kuminga into these playoff caliber teams or teams that are in the playoffs right now and wonder where Kuminga would be in their rotations if he was on another team. And then you're talking about compromising everything for the Warriors in terms of the level of defense that they could play. And then also offensively, you gotta shift everything, throw everything out the window just to appease to the needs of Jonathan Kuminga while Steph Curry stands in the corner. This is some of the goofiest things I've ever heard in my life. You know, when Steph Curry first came onto the scene and he was being put next to Monte Ellis, I said all along that they needed to trade Monte Ellis. And Monte Ellis was a fan favorite. If you're a Warriors fan, you love Monte Ellis, right? And yet you could clearly see, or at least I could see very clearly, that Steph Curry had a trajectory that would be much better than Monte Ellis. And they cannot play next to each other at the same time. To me, the Warriors prioritizing Monte Ellis over Steph Curry after seeing what Steph Curry was able to do in his rookie year was the equivalent of the Cavaliers prioritizing Ricky Davis over LeBron James. The only difference between LeBron James and Steph Curry after their rookie years is that LeBron James was touted from the jump, #1 overall pick. Clearly, Steph Curry should also have been a #1 overall pick in his draft, and he ended up not being that, and his own team undervalued him completely and utterly. And they essentially wasted 2 extra years after Steph Curry's rookie year by continuously holding on to Monte Ellis, who was holding back Steph Curry's ability to take this team to another level if you build correctly around him and not continue to force him to play second fiddle while playing this tiny backcourt of a couple of 6'3" point guards. So think about that for a second. Monte Ellis at his peak next to Steph Curry was much better than Jonathan Kuminga, and I still wanted Monte Ellis out of here. And look what happened once they did get rid of him and gave the reins to Steph Curry. You know, back in the 2012 season, I actually talked to Steph Curry about this very thing and told him that if he really wants to shine in the NBA, he needs an opportunity.
Becoming an MVP and just becoming so big like that, I think it was sort of like a team situation. They kind of paved the way for him to become that, because they pretty much got rid of Heinrich. So there was no backcourt to really, share for him to share the ball with. It was just, he was going to be a one-headed monster point guard. I mean, when your starting shooting guard is Keith Bogans, obviously you're going to be doing a majority of the ball handling. I thought that was a big factor in why he became the player he became in the third season. Opportunity.
That's what it takes in the league, for sure. You got to have the opportunity to shine and succeed or fail at it. So he took that and ran with it, for sure.
I'm mentioning this because I feel the same way about you. Yeah, that's. I mean, I feel like it's really all about opportunity, and I'm not gonna ask you about how you feel about playing with Monte and all that stuff. I feel like that's probably like something you wouldn't want to really answer. But you did hear about the whole Rudy Gay rumor, right?
I heard about it yesterday, and honestly, if you were in a GM's office for 24 hours, you'd probably hear 50 to 60 just off the wall. What if this would work? What if this would go through? All that kind of stuff. So I don't pay attention to anything unless it happens. I mean, there's no way. I don't, because everybody's trying to make moves and do what they want to make their team better, or what they think would make their team better. But I think our team is solid with what we have. So it's just a lot of talk with no action right now.
And I was basically insinuating that he has to kind of get away from Monte Ellis to really become his own in the NBA. But obviously Steph Curry wouldn't want to have any conversation like that. He loved Monte Ellis, and he still loves him to this day, even though Monte from the jump said that he couldn't play with Steph Curry when they drafted him. So I'm that guy. I'm the guy who wanted Monte Ellis off the Warriors. And you got Jonathan Kuminga fans going crazy. Jonathan Kuminga has proven absolutely nothing in this league in 4 years already. And I don't blame him for any of this. He should have been moved to a different team all along. This is nobody's fault but Joe Lacob's. I've been saying that all along. But it's time for the Warriors and Joe Lacob to get away from this mistake and let Jonathan Kuminga thrive elsewhere. And all they did over the last 4 years is screw him and his opportunity to maximize his earnings in the NBA, because he never got to play 30 plus minutes per game as a starter, as a lottery pick, an opportunity that should have been given to him. But the Warriors with Steph Curry on their team can't give him that opportunity. I said that all along for the last 3 years. This way, Jonathan Kuminga fans can be happy knowing that their guy gets to play the minutes that they feel that he deserves, and he probably does deserve as a lottery pick. But again, not on the Warriors. It's that simple. Trade him. Bring back a piece that makes more sense for the Steph Curry timeline, because that timeline and its window is running out. Winning a championship, winning a title is and should be everything. When you have a player that is capable of bringing you championships, proven again and again and again, well, that's the thing that you should be doing and prioritizing, instead of planning for some future that may or may not bring you any playoff run whatsoever. So yes, when it comes to this situation, I actually concede to Steve Kerr, because he's right. The time to move on from Jonathan Kuminga was back in the 22-23 season, and the Warriors missed out, and they missed out again the following year, and they missed out again this year. If the Warriors simply traded for OG Anunoby in the 22-23 season, the Warriors probably already have their 5th title by now, if not their 6th, and gunning for whatever this season. And they probably never would have even had to have moved Klay Thompson, because Klay Thompson, Steph Curry, OG Anunoby, Andrew Wiggins, Draymond Green, GP2, Kevon Looney, these pieces are winning at least another title after the 21-22 season. The only good news now is that it's still not too late. The Warriors cannot waste any more time with Jonathan Kuminga still on their freaking roster, constantly creating controversy and chaos, completely unnecessary. Anyway, when it comes to Warriors players analysis, there is plenty more to come this offseason. This was very long-winded, but absolutely necessary. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time.